In the damp, restless morning of the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, a woman walked her final steps across the uneven grounds of Tower Green, not as a queen, not even as a traitor, but as a cautionary tale. Her name was Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII, once crowned with golden glory in Westminster Abbey and hailed as the mother of England's future. But in this final act of her life, she was no longer a monarch, no longer a wife, not even a mother in the eyes of the state. She was a symbol of what happens when a woman becomes too powerful, too influential, too inconvenient. And so, her death was not arranged merely as a punishment, it was choreographed as a warning, executed not only with a sword but with silence, distortion, and deliberate humiliation. For 17 days, Anne was held in the Tower of London, the very fortress that had once prepared her for coronation. During that brief but unbearable time, she was cut off from her allies, surrounded by stone, by guards, by ghosts of all the things she had once believed unshakable. Her father no longer defended her. Her uncle condemned her. Her husband, Henry, once her greatest love, and the man who had defied Rome for her, now sought to destroy her not just in body, but in legacy. She was accused of treason, adultery, incest, and conspiracy. But no one close to power believed the charges. They were political theatre, designed to produce a specific ending: the fall of a queen who had failed to produce a son and dared to speak too freely. The horror of Anne's final days was not in the inevitability of death, but in the erosion of her dignity, the meticulous unmaking of her identity. Her execution was delayed not once but 3 times each postponement, a slow twisting of psychological torment, forcing her to wake each morning not knowing if it would be her last. This was a tactic long practiced in Tudor England, not as mercy, but as a method of dismantling the soul. By the time the morning of her execution arrived, Anne had not slept for over 24 hours. Records show she spent much of the previous night kneeling in prayer, requesting the sacrament at 2 o'clock in the morning, perhaps hoping that communion might cleanse not her sins of which she had not been guilty but her dread. When she was summoned at dawn, she smiled, she laughed, she joked with her attendants. Observers at the time described her demeanor as calm, almost cheerful. But modern eyes recognize what those around her could not name: dissociation. Her mind, strained past its limits, had retreated into a kind of fragile detachment. Her body walked to death, but her spirit floated above it, unable or unwilling to fully accept the reality of what was to come. She remarked that she had a little neck, a joke, dark and absurd, that would echo through history. But what lay behind those words was not humor, but surrender, not submission to guilt, but to inevitability. Tower Green was not a grand stage. The scaffold was only 3 feet high.
Goodbye, my dearest.
This was not an oversight. It was intentional. A queen brought low, forced to kneel within reach of the murmuring crowd. Her execution, not a solemn state matter, but a grotesque public play. Henry had ordered a French swordsman, a move many historians misinterpret as mercy.
Goodbye, my dearest.
In truth, it was theatre. The sword was swift, yes, but it was also foreign, another way to strip Anne of the trappings of English tradition. She would not die by the hands of an Englishman. She would die as an outsider, a traître, a woman no longer worthy of the land she once ruled. Before the blade fell, Anne was permitted to speak. It was customary, not compassionate. She was allowed to address the crowd, but her words were shackled by the invisible chains of survival instinct. She praised the king, thanked God, and accepted the law's judgment. But she did not confess. In that omission was the last remnant of resistance. To admit guilt would have been to justify the machinery that had crushed her. To deny it outright might have endangered her daughter Elizabeth. So Anne spoke carefully, clearly, and with a kind of grace that few around her could understand. She was not dying just for herself. She was dying in hopes that her composure might save what was left of her bloodline. The executioner, a skilled man imported from Calais, had practiced on animals to perfect the single strike. Anne kneeled upright, as per French custom, her neck extended without the aid of a block. She was blindfolded. She could not see the blade. She could only listen, muscles frozen, for the subtle shift of air that would announce her end. And when the sword did come, it was clean merciful, only in comparison to the brutality that had come before. Her head fell, but witnesses swore her lips moved after, that her eyes, still beneath the blindfold, fluttered for a few seconds more. It is possible, scientifically, that Anne was still aware, still conscious, for as long as 30 seconds after the blow, that in that narrow span of time, her mind remained a ghost in her head, no longer tethered to breath. What happened next was not dignity. There was no coffin prepared. Her attendants, overcome with grief, had to wrap her body in a piece of cloth and place it in an old chest, one that likely once held arrows. She was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor, next to others who had fallen not in battle, but in disgrace. There were no trumpets, no clergy, no funeral rites worthy of a queen. Her crown had been stripped long before the blade arrived. And then came the erasure. Henry ordered all her portraits destroyed, her emblems removed from court, her initials scraped from the walls of palaces where she had once been adored, her name forbidden to be spoken in polite company. Even her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate, removed from succession, and left without care or title. The goal was not just death. The goal was annihilation. But what makes Anne Boleyn's story more chilling than any blade is that this erasure nearly succeeded for generations. The history repeated the lies Henry wanted the world to remember, that she was a witch, a séductrice, a traiteur, that her fall was inevitable. But as we now step back into her story, peeling away the layers of propaganda and fear, we find not a monster, but a woman who rose too high in a world built to hold her down, a woman who was punished for her ambition, her wit, her refusal to stay silent, a woman who died not just by sword, but by strategy, not just by king, but by country. And now, centuries later, the silence she was forced into has become a whisper that echoes across time. Her death was not the end. It was the beginning of a long reckoning with truth, and the daughter she left behind, Elizabeth, would one day rise, not in shame, but in triumph, to become the very monarch that Henry had so desperately tried to replace. The irony could not be greater. The legacy Anne Boleyn gave birth to would outshine them all. Before the blade was ever raised, before the scaffold was hammered together or the French swordsman summoned across the Channel, Anne Boleyn was already marked for erasure, not for crimes proven or treason, whispered in candlelit corners. But because her very existence had become an inconvenience to the crown she once wore, to understand the magnitude of her fall, one must return to the glittering beginnings of her rise. A rise that threatened the balance of power, tradition, and male authority, in ways the Tudor court had never tolerated in a woman, let alone a queen. Anne's ascent was not the quiet blooming of a noble lady destined for royal marriage, but the storm of a woman who broke every mold placed before her. Unlike the pliant queens of old, Anne challenged, argued, flirted, withheld. She did not come to court to serve, she came to be seen, to be heard, and eventually to be obeyed. While others simpered in the shadows, Anne sparred with ambassadors, countered theological arguments, and captured not only the gaze of King Henry VIII, but his entire political will. For 7 years, he bent the world to her image, severing England from the Pope's authority, reshaping the very soul of the realm to make her queen. But what had once been intoxicating to the king soon soured. Power desired is not the same as power possessed, and when Anne crossed the threshold from mistress to monarch, her defiance once adored became dangerous. She did not bear a son. That, perhaps, sealed her fate more than any whispered accusation or courtly betrayal. The boy she miscarried in January of the year 1536 was not just a child lost, it was the last thread holding her position together. The Tudor dynasty was a fragile scaffolding of lineage and masculine succession, and without a male heir, Anne's enemies began to stir. Sensing blood in the water, they did not need to fabricate much. Whispers were enough. A flirtation here, I just misheard, a brother too often at her side. Rumours, in Henry's England, could blossom into charges overnight. And with Thomas Cromwell, the king's shadow architect, watching her fall with calculating eyes, the wheels of her downfall began to turn in silence. To those who had once bowed before her, Anne had become a cautionary presence. She was too bold in her speech, too direct in her judgments, too involved in affairs of state. Her intelligence, once celebrated, now looked suspicious in a world that valued obedient queens and silent courtiers. She dared to disagree with Henry on matters of foreign policy, dared to challenge Cromwell on questions of religion and reform, and most dangerously, she still believed herself secure enough to speak as if she mattered. But the court is never loyal to a falling star. Once the tide shifted, those who once championed her began to retreat. Her friends became scarce. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced with spies. Her chambers, once filled with music and letters, became a prison of long silences and longer glances. And then came the arrests first. The men, then the Queen. 5 men were taken within days. Among them, her brother George. They were accused of adultery with the Queen, of incest, of treasonous conspiracy, the charges as grotesque as they were implausible. Yet none dared challenge them publicly. Evidence was manufactured, confessions extracted, trials arranged as performances rather than legal inquiries. It was a method of systematic dismemberment, removing her defenders one by one, so that when her turn came, there would be no shield left. Anne was arrested on the 2nd day of May in the year 1536. She was taken to the Tower by boat along the Thames, the same path she had travelled 3 years earlier, as a bride to be crowned. That journey had been triumphant, lined with cheering crowds, riverbanks crowded with banners, the city in celebration. This time, there were no cheers, no heralds, no joy, only silence, wind, and the quiet turning of fate. Inside the Tower, she was not housed in the dungeons, but in the same royal apartments where she had once prepared for her coronation. The irony was deliberate. Her prison was dressed in memories of glory, a cruel trick of place and memory. For 17 days, she was held there, awaiting a fate that seemed to shift by the hour. Each morning brought fresh rumours, a pardon, a delay, a reprieve, a blade. The uncertainty was not incidental. It was part of the process. Henry wanted her broken long before she reached the scaffold. During her confinement, she was interrogated multiple times. She was denied access to her chaplains. Letters from her family were withheld. She was not informed of the fate of the men who had already been condemned in her name. And still, through it all, she kept her composure. She prayed. She spoke calmly. She demanded justice. Not for clemency, she never begged, but for truth. She believed, perhaps foolishly, that the sheer absurdity of the charges would protect her. But Anne had misunderstood the moment. This was not about truth. It was about utility, and she had ceased to be useful. Her trial took place on the 15th day of May. She was charged with adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king, and high treason. The outcome had already been written. The judges were handpicked. The evidence was laughable. She defended herself with wit and courage, denying each charge with clarity and dignity. But dignity had no place in the hall that day. The verdict? Unanimous. Guilty. The sentence? Death by burning or beheading. Henry, in what some called mercy, chose the sword. She knew then that there would be no appeal, no rescue. Her fate had been sealed, not in the courtroom, but in the king's heart. Long before the accusations had been spoken, what she may not have fully grasped, even then, was that her death was not the conclusion, but the beginning of her erasure. Henry did not simply want her gone. He wanted her undone. In the days that followed, she was forced to watch the slow dismantling of her world. The servants who once adored her no longer met her eyes. The letters she wrote went unanswered. Her daughter Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. The nursery was disbanded. Her child's royal future dissolved like ink in water. And in her final moments, perhaps the deepest cruelty was the knowledge that her bloodline, her very flesh and legacy, had been declared unworthy of a crown she had nearly died to secure. And yet, despite all of it, the humiliation, the betrayal, the legal farce, the spiritual isolation, Anne remained composed, not unfeeling, but resolved. Her final days were filled with prayer, with quiet laughter, with gallows humor that masked unspeakable sorrow. She made peace with her attendants. She gave instructions for her modest burial, and she prepared herself to die not as a queen deposed, but as a woman defiant, even in silence. What Henry and his court feared most was not Anne's voice, but the memory of her voice, her wit, her will. To her courage, they were threats that could not be allowed to echo in the halls of power. And so, her execution was only the first blow. The next would come in whispers, in paint scraped from canvas, in initials carved out of palace woodwork, in songs no longer sung, in silence taught like loyalty. The aim was not justice, it was annihilation. But the truth has a strange way of surviving, even in shadows. Though Anne Boleyn's body was laid to rest without a coffin, in a chest meant for arrows, her story did not rot beneath the chapel floor. It lingered. It waited. It whispered to future generations that power, when threatened, does not kill cleanly. It kills slowly, thoroughly, and with spectacle. Yet even the most carefully staged spectacle cannot prevent memory from breaking through the cracks of time. Anne Boleyn was not perfect. She was flawed, ambitious, proud, sharp-tongued. But none of these were crimes. Her true crime was that she rose, and in a world built to keep women small, that was enough to warrant the sharpest sword. The Tower of London, with its cold grey walls and ancient battlements, has always been remembered as a fortress of steel and stone, a place where prisoners waited for justice or death. But for Anne Boleyn, the tower was not a cell of iron bars and locked doors. It was a psychological labyrinth carefully built to dismantle her spirit. When she entered its gates for the second and final time, she was not placed in a dungeon with rats and straw. She was escorted instead to the very chambers where she had once been prepared to become queen. Curtains of silk still hung at the windows. The floors were still polished. The scent of wax and incense still lingered in the air. It was a cruel joke, an echo of glory wrapped around despair, a reminder of how quickly the highest crown in England could transform into a crown of thorns. Anne had been brought by river barge on the 2nd day of May in the year 1536, gliding down the Thames as she had 3 years earlier for her coronation. Back then, bells had rung in celebration, and banners had fluttered above the crowds. The riverbanks alive with cheers for the woman who had broken a kingdom to become its queen. Now the water was silent. The banks were empty. She stepped ashore not as a triumph, but as a condemned woman, surrounded by guards whose faces were blank with indifference. The echo of oars in the water was like a funeral drum. That was the first strike against her, not the charges, but the spectacle of reversal. A silent announcement to all of London that power is a loan, not a gift, and that a king can reclaim it at any moment. Inside the tower, Anne was lodged in the Queen's house, a set of royal apartments normally reserved for honoured guests. To any outsider, the accommodations might have seemed generous, but for Anne, they were a trap disguised as courtesy. Every object in those rooms had once signified her ascension. The tapestries had been hung for her coronation banquet. The walls had echoed with songs sung in her honour. Now they whispered only of loss. This was not mercy. It was calculated cruelty. The place itself became part of her punishment, forcing her to look upon the trappings of power she had worn and know they no longer belonged to her. Each day within those walls was an assault of uncertainty. She did not know when she would be called to trial, when she would be condemned, when she would be led out to die. The dates shifted, the hours slipped. Every dawn was a possible execution morning. Every sunset, a reprieve. The human mind, under such conditions, begins to fracture. Sleep becomes shallow. Thoughts loop endlessly. Hope and despair twist together until they are indistinguishable. And still, Anne prayed. She sang softly to herself. She rehearsed her speeches, her prayers, her composure, like an actress in a play whose ending she could not rewrite. Visitors were carefully chosen, not to comfort her, but to extract. She was interrogated about her alleged lovers. She was questioned about her brother. The very people she had once trusted were now gone. Their silence, a verdict. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced with watchers who reported her words and moods back to Thomas Cromwell, the king's architect of ruin. Every sigh, every tear, every moment of calm became a data point in the slow dismantling of her defences. This was not imprisonment as punishment. This was imprisonment as erasure. Before they severed her head, they wanted to sever her will. Yet Anne's spirit did not break easily. Even within those walls, she displayed flashes of the same defiance that had once captivated Henry. She spoke of her innocence. She asked for the sacrament. She composed herself with dignity before visitors, even when she was shaking inside. At times, she even laughed, the sound startling in its brightness, like sunlight in a crypt. Her humour was dark but sharp. "I have but a little neck," she quipped, touching her throat, a line that would echo across centuries as both tragedy and defiance. Some saw madness in that laughter. Others saw courage. Perhaps it was both the last defence of a woman determined not to let her captors see her despair. The tower's walls were thick, but whispers travelled, through servants, through scraps of conversation. Anne began to understand the scale of what had been orchestrated against her. The men accused alongside her, 5 of them, including her brother George, had been tried and executed within days. She had been cut off from news of their deaths, but she could feel the absence like a wound. The strategy was clear. Remove her defenders first, stain her reputation with their blood, and leave her alone. Surrounded by the echo of accusations she could not disprove because the accused were already dead. It was a tactic of isolation, a method of psychological siege. As the days dragged on, the tower ceased to feel like a place of stone at all. It became a living thing, a creature with 1,000 eyes watching her, 1,000 mouths whispering lies, 1,000 cold hands tugging at her resolve. It was not the walls that imprisoned her, but the silence between them, the shifting of dates, the deliberate postponements, the knowledge that she was being studied, her fear measured and weighed like evidence. And yet, through it all, she maintained a kind of stillness. She wrote letters to Henry, though they went unanswered. She prayed for her daughter. She prepared her soul for death, even as she clung to a sliver of hope that truth might prevail. This was the real prison, not stone, not steel, but anticipation. The anticipation of the blade became a blade of its own, cutting into her day after day. When she closed her eyes at night, she could hear the scaffold being built. When she opened them in the morning, she wondered if this would be the day she would mount it. Her captors did not need to harm her physically. They simply needed to let time do the work time. Silence, and the slow peeling away of everything that had once made her Anne Boleyn. Yet, in a twist of irony the king could never have predicted, this period of waiting forged in her something unbreakable. By the time she walked from those chambers to the scaffold, she had endured not just imprisonment, but a ritual stripping away of fear. Her composure at the end, the calm that startled witnesses, was not born of serenity but of exhaustion. The tower had already killed the part of her that could panic. What walked out onto Tower Green was a woman hollowed out by 17 days of psychological warfare, yet still somehow radiant with a dignity no blade could sever. This was why her execution struck so deep into the heart of those who saw it. They expected a broken prisoner. Instead, they saw a queen stripped of crown, stripped of title, stripped of everything but her final, unshaken self. The prison that was not made of stone had done its work, but it had also, in a strange and terrible way, freed her from fear. In that sense, Anne Boleyn's last walk was not simply toward death. It was the only walk left to a woman who had been turned into a ghost long before the sword touched her neck. On the morning of the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, as the city of London stirred beneath a pale spring sky, Anne Boleyn dressed for death. Her garments, chosen with the precision of someone who understood the language of symbols, were of a deep, muted grey, sombre but not funereal. Modest but not meek, she refused to wear the black of mourning, for there was nothing she wished to mourn. There was no veil, not plear, no illusion of mercy left. Only the scaffold awaited her, and beyond it, perhaps silence, or perhaps something more enduring. But before she could vanish from the world, there was still a performance to complete. One last ritual, one final humiliation wrapped in the polished blade of a foreign sword. Henry had ordered a swordsman from Calais. This detail, repeated endlessly by historians as evidence of the king's so-called compassion, was in fact a calculated act of distance. An English executioner would have used an axe, a brutal, imprecise tool that required multiple blows, more often than not, and left the condemned gasping, sometimes conscious, between each thud. But the sword, a long, slender blade wielded with a horizontal swing, was cleaner, more theatrical, and most importantly, foreign. Anne's death, Henry had decided, would be swift, efficient, and devoid of any connection to the realm she had once helped shape. He would not let an Englishman strike her down. He would outsource her final moment, like a distasteful task delegated to a servant. And so the swordsman arrived. His name was never recorded, but his presence cast a shadow long after the blade fell. He was a professional, renowned for his skill. A man who had trained for moments like this not merely to kill, but to kill beautifully. It is said that he practiced his stroke on animals in preparation, seeking that perfect arc, that seamless separation of flesh from bone. This was not mercy. This was choreography. A queen's final breath would be choreographed like a court masque. And the stage had been set. At Tower Green, the scaffold had been built lower than usual, barely 3 feet off the ground. This was no accident. Anne would kneel almost at eye level with the crowd. Her death would be intimate, unignorable. The people would not see a distant silhouette crumple far above their heads. They would see her face, her hands, her body tremble, or not, her eyes open or closed. They would see the moment her life left her, and in seeing it, they would be reminded of what happens to women who rise too high, speak too sharply, or believe too deeply in their own invincibility. Anne was led from her chambers in silence. She walked without faltering, though her body must have been hollow with exhaustion. She had not slept. She had prayed through the night, whispering psalms until her voice cracked and her lips bled from the dry air. She was accompanied by a small retinue of attendants, those few who had not yet been dismissed or silenced. They wept as they followed, but Anne did not. Her face was pale, drawn, but composed. Those who watched her pass through the courtyard later wrote that she looked almost luminous, as if some strange peace had settled over her. But peace was not the right word. What settled on her was resolve, the kind born not of comfort, but of clarity, the kind that comes when a woman knows that nothing more can be taken from her. She mounted the scaffold with grace. No trembling, no collapse. She stood alone before the crowd, no family beside her, no priest at her elbow, no husband waiting to hold her hand. Henry, ever absent, remained at Whitehall Palace, already preparing for his marriage to Jane Seymour. By the time Anne's body cooled, he would be writing letters of engagement. By the time her bones settled beneath the stones of the chapel, he would be measuring for a new queen's coronation robes. He did not look back. Anne was given a chance to speak. It was tradition, not kindness. These final words were expected to be carefully measured, laced with praise for the king, a humble acceptance of guilt, a final submission to the justice of the realm. Anne spoke softly but clearly. She did not confess. She did not apologize. She did not name names or curse those who betrayed her. Instead, she said what needed to be said to protect Elizabeth, the child whose future might still depend on the illusion of her mother's humility. She called Henry a gracious lord. She declared herself obedient to the law. She yielded to the judgment handed down, and in doing so, she buried the truth with dignity, refusing to give her enemies a single word they could twist. Then came the ritual. A blindfold was offered. She accepted. Tradition. Again, not to spare her from seeing the sword, for she would never see it, but to prevent her from flinching, to keep her still, to make her a statue of resolve. She did not lie down upon a block. The French custom required her to kneel upright, hands clasped, neck exposed, body perfectly still. The executioner stood behind and slightly to the side, sword hidden from view. She could not see it. She could only wait. And this, perhaps, was the cruelest moment of all. Not the strike itself, but the waiting, the silence, the aching pause between breath and blade. The executioner, trained to distract, called out for his assistant to fetch the sword, even though it was already in his hand. Anne, confused, turned her head slightly, and in that instant, he swung. The blade was clean, perfect. One strike, her head fell forward into a basket. Her body slumped silently to the boards, but the silence did not last. Witnesses gasped. A few fainted. Some swore her eyes still fluttered, that her mouth moved as if finishing a prayer. That, for a few heartbeats longer, she lingered in the gap between life and death, consciousness refusing to vanish. It is medically possible, perhaps even likely, that Anne Boleyn's mind remained aware for as long as 30 seconds after her head was severed, that her final thoughts were not of peace, but of motion, sound, the feel of air on her skin, the desperate flicker of self trying to remain. And then came the display. The executioner lifted her head by the hair and turned it to the crowd. Blood still dripped from the severed neck, spattering the wood beneath his feet. Her face, once adorned with jewels and veils, now stared blankly at the people who had cheered her rise, and now watched her fall. The hush that followed was heavy, not reverent but stunned, as if the weight of what had just occurred had not yet settled on the shoulders of those present. There was no coffin prepared. Her attendants, now weeping uncontrollably. They were forced to wrap her body in linen and place it into a common arrow chest, an old storage box repurposed in haste. She was carried to the chapel of St. Plains, Peter ad vincula, and buried beneath the floor. Her grave unmarked, unnamed, unblessed. A queen, once crowned with rubies and praised by choirs, now laid in darkness beneath flagstones, walked over by strangers. This was not merely an execution. It was a statement, a declaration that even the most powerful woman in England could be reduced to silence, that no voice, no wit, no crown could protect against the wrath of a king determined to forget. Anne's headless body was not the end of her story. It was the final image of a performance designed to terrify, to dominate, to erase. And yet, despite every effort to strip her of dignity, to turn her final breath into a lesson for others, something else endured. In the hearts of her attendants, in the whispered prayers of those who dared remember her, in the eyes of a small girl named Elizabeth, who would one day wear the crown herself, Anne Boleyn remained, not as a victim, not as a traitor, but as a woman who knelt with pride, faced the sword, and met death not with screams, but with silence, and in that silence, spoke louder than any king. They had prepared no coffin. That detail alone speaks volumes. In the orchestrated spectacle of Anne Boleyn's destruction, everything had been planned with obsessive precision, every gesture, every word, every silence. The foreign swordsman summoned from Calais, the scaffold placed low to the ground, the blindfold offered, the execution staged not at dawn but mid-morning to maximize attention. Every piece of the pageant had been carefully curated to transform a queen into a cautionary tale. But for her body, for the last fragile remnants of her humanity, there had been no plan at all. The woman whose rise had shattered kingdoms and whose death had required a sword imported from across the sea was, in the end, disposed of with less care than a soldier fallen on the battlefield. No carriage draped in black, no velvet-lined bier, no marble tomb with Latin inscriptions. There was, instead, an old arrow chest, half rotted, its wood splintering at the corners, pulled from the tower's storerooms in haste. And into this, they placed her. The attendants who performed this final task were not officials. They were not guards. They were women. The same women who had dressed her, combed her hair, stood with her through the sleepless nights in the tower. Now, trembling and pale, they were ordered to gather her remains, to cradle the body of their mistress and lower it into a box once used to store weapons. They had watched her die with dignity. Now they had to carry the weight of her violated flesh, her head resting beside her torso, wrapped in linen too coarse for a queen. Some accounts say they could not stop weeping. Others say they worked in silence, afraid that any expression of grief might be interpreted as disloyalty. In the court of Henry VIII, even tears could be treason. They had no priests, no incense, no psalm, no carved cross to lay upon her chest. What they had was haste and silence. The execution was over. The crowd had already begun to disperse, some lingering to gossip, others returning to their lives, as though the beheading of a queen were a matter as ordinary as a change in the weather. A few nobles, required by protocol to witness the event, had already mounted their horses and departed, their minds already occupied with the affairs of the king's upcoming betrothal. For them, Anne had never been a person. She had been a disruption, a political flame that had burned too hot, and now, mercifully, had been extinguished. The arrow chest was small, too small. Her body had to be folded, the limbs arranged tightly, the linen pulled taut to fit her inside. The head, according to whispered recollections, was placed beside the body, not beneath it. No ceremony, no royal handling. Her hair, once perfumed and braided in the French fashion, was now soaked in blood, clinging to her skin like ivy. Her neck, where once had rested a strand of pearls gifted by the king himself, now bore only the ragged wound of steel. They carried her to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the little church within the tower grounds, reserved not for saints but for the disgraced. It was a cold, stone space, echoing with the ghosts of those who had already fallen beneath Henry's hand and those still to come. There, in the dirt floor beneath the altar, they lowered the arrow chest. No marker was carved. No name was spoken. The stone laid above her bore no epitaph. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was laid among the forgotten, interred not as a monarch, but as a memory, to be buried as quickly as possible. And yet it is in this moment, not in the sword's arc, nor in the crowd's silence, nor in the king's retreat, that the cruelty of her death reveals its sharpest edge. Not because it was violent, though it was, not because it was unjust, though it was, but because even in death, Anne was denied the smallest dignity. The woman who had once carried the hopes of a reformed England, the mother of a future queen, the force that had torn a nation from the grip of Rome, this woman was laid to rest like refuse. No funeral bell was rung. No herald declared her passage. There was only the scraping of stone, the thud of earth, and the quiet sobs of women who knew they would never speak of this again. It was not just a burial. It was an attempt at erasure, and from the moment the arrow chest was covered by the chapel floor, the work of forgetting her began in earnest. Henry ordered her portraits destroyed. Artists were instructed to scrape away her image. Her initials, her emblem, a crowned falcon standing on a tree stump removed from walls and window panes. Her name was erased from records. Her titles stricken from court documents. Elizabeth, the child, she had risked everything to give a crown, was declared illegitimate, demoted to lady, removed from the succession. Within days, Jane Seymour was brought to court. Within 10, she was betrothed. Within 11, she wore the jewels that had once rested on Anne's fingers. But no matter how carefully they tried to hide her, the memory of Anne Boleyn would not go quietly. For those women who had wrapped her in cloth and placed her in a box, there were nightmares. Some are said to have retired from court, vanishing into convents or distant households. Their silence, the only way to protect themselves from a world that punished loyalty with death. For Elizabeth, though too young to understand, the shadow of her mother's fate would remain with her for the rest of her life. A shadow she would one day step out of, but never fully escape. And for the tower itself, the place that had witnessed her rise and fall, the memory remained etched into stone. Tour guides in later centuries would whisper her name in hushed tones, pointing to a slab in the chapel where no words are carved, only stone worn smooth by the feet of those who came after. Visitors left flowers. Historians argued over bones. But the truth remains. Anne Boleyn was buried, not just in haste, but with intention. It was not enough for her to die. She had to vanish. Yet vanish she did not. The chest that replaced a coffin could not contain what Anne had become. Though stripped of crown, life, and even grave, she lingered in the imagination of the people. In ballads, in books, in paintings smuggled and hidden, and, most profoundly, in her daughter. Elizabeth would rise, not just as a monarch but as an idea, the living defiance of the man who had tried to erase her mother. What began in an arrow chest would not end there. For though the world tried to shut the lid on Anne Boleyn's story, history had other plans. Her name would return, not in whispers, but in coronations, not in shame, but in sovereignty. And the chapel where she was buried without a word would, centurer la terre, bear her name on a simple brass plate, not because Henry allowed it, but because time, memory, and justice refused to forget. When the sword fell on Tower Green and Anne Boleyn's body was carried away in a chest unfit for royalty, the world did not end. But for her daughter Elizabeth, it quietly unravelled. She was not yet 3 years old when her mother was executed, too young to comprehend loss, but not too young to feel it. In the days that followed the Queen's death, the palace where Elizabeth had lived was stripped of warmth and familiarity. Her nursery, once filled with music, laughter, and soft-spoken comfort, became a chamber of whispers. Her attendant disappeared, her toys removed, her lessons halted. But the worst absence was not the loss of her mother's face. It was the loss of her name, because after the blade came down, Elizabeth was no longer the king's daughter. She was, officially, nothing, declared illegitimate by royal decree. Her title of princess was revoked. In documents, she became simply Lady Elizabeth, a child without inheritance, stripped of succession, stripped of identity, and though she remained alive, clothed and fed within the royal household, she had become invisible. Those who once knelt before her now looked away. Those who had once addressed her with reverence now spoke to her with caution. To love Elizabeth too openly was to risk suspicion. To mention her mother was dangerous. The air around her thickened with unease. She had not been imprisoned in stone. Like Anne, she had been imprisoned in silence. For children, the world is made not of words, but of tones, glances, gestures. Elizabeth learned, before she could read or write, that the very sound of her mother's name brought tension to a room. That questions about her past caused discomfort. That loyalty was not something to be offered, it was something to be feared. Her caretakers, those still assigned to her, were careful, distant, loyal first to the king, and only secondarily to the orphaned girl, now wandering palace corridors without a voice. Anne had once dreamed of her daughter ruling England. That dream had cost her everything. And now, in the days after her death, it seemed laughable. How could this small, red-haired child, born of a marriage declared null, from a woman declared traitor, ever sit upon a throne? Even the very blood in her veins had become suspect. She was born of a woman executed for adultery and incest. The court treated her not with anger, but with pity, a pity sharpened with coldness. She had been born royal, but now she was a shadow. And yet, even in these early years, something unspoken stirred in Elizabeth. She did not cry for her lost title. She did not beg for restoration. She did not throw tantrums or collapse under the weight of erasure. She watched. She listened. She learned. She observed how quickly affection could turn to exile. How easily the word daughter could become bastard. How a crown placed in joy could be removed in silence. These were not lessons taught by tutors. These were lessons learned by being alone. In time, she would come to understand the full extent of her mother's fall, not just the execution, but the whispers, the lies, the rewriting of history. She would read of Anne's trials. She would study the men who condemned her. She would gaze upon portraits of Jane Seymour, her father's next wife, and see the woman who replaced her mother in every way. The court allowed. But Elizabeth did not respond with rage. She responded with restraint. Her mind, like her mother's, it was sharp, analytical, exacting, and where Anne had wielded influence with fire and defiance, Elizabeth would learn to wield it with silence and patience. For years, she lived in the shadows. Her half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, also lived in disgrace during Anne's reign, and now found a strange mirror in Elizabeth's fall. But even Mary, though displaced, had the legacy of a long marriage behind her, a mother revered across Europe. Elizabeth had nothing, no mother, no legitimacy, no promise, only memories she could not speak aloud and dreams she could not admit to having. Yet something remained, a kind of invisible thread. The same blood that had once coursed through Anne Boleyn's veins now ran through hers. The defiance that had brought Anne to Henry's throne, the intellect that had challenged scholars, the charm that had turned a nation on its head, all of it now lived quietly in her daughter, buried beneath years of forced humility. Elizabeth grew up in a kingdom that refused to acknowledge her, and in that refusal, she became powerful, not through title, but through knowledge. She devoured books. She mastered languages. She learned diplomacy not from instruction, but from necessity. She watched monarchs come and go. She watched her father change wives like seasons, watched her brother Edward rise and fall, watched Mary ascend the throne and rule with iron devotion. And all the while, Elizabeth waited not with bitterness, but with calculation. When she finally became queen against all odds, against centuries of prophecy and political opposition, it was not a moment of vindication. It was a moment of balance. Because Elizabeth did not rule as her mother might have. She did not seek revenge. She did not rewrite the past. She did not order Anne's name to be spoken in court or her titles restored by royal edict. She did something far more powerful. She ruled in her mother's shadow and allowed her reign to speak for them both. Anne Boleyn had died to make way for a male heir, but the male heir had died young. It was the daughter no one wanted, the daughter denied, who rose to define an age. In every coin struck with Elizabeth's image, in every court ruled with her voice, in every foreign negotiation steered by her wit, Anne Boleyn lived again, not in body, not even in name, but in legacy. Where Anne had been erased, Elizabeth engraved. Where Anne had been silenced, Elizabeth spoke, measured, firm, unwavering. Where Anne had died alone, unmourned, Elizabeth reigned alone, unbroken. And perhaps that is the final truth of this inheritance, not one of vengeance, but of victory through endurance. Anne Boleyn was thrown into an arrow chest and buried without a name. Elizabeth Tudor rose from that nameless grave, crowned not by the court's permission, but by time's judgment, and in doing so, she ensured that neither she nor her mother would ever again be ignored. When Anne Boleyn's blood had cooled on the scaffold and her body lay buried beneath the chapel floor, when the crowd had dispersed and the murmurs faded into the damp stones of the tower, the court of Henry VIII did something remarkable, not in its cruelty, but in its composure. It simply moved on. Not a pause, not a day of mourning, not a single breath held in reflection. The very court that had once knelt before Anne in reverence, that had toasted her health at banquets, danced beneath her gaze, whispered favours into her ear, now carried on as if she had never existed at all. Her fall was not treated as a tragedy. It was treated as a correction, a course adjusted, a stain wiped clean from the tapestry of the monarchy. And those who had once bowed to her adjusted themselves effortlessly to the new order, smoothing their sleeves, lowering their eyes, and pretending nothing had happened. The morning after her execution, the court awoke not to silence, but to preparation, for while the axe, or rather, the sword had ended one chapter, another had already begun drafting its prologue. On that same day, Henry VIII became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. 11 days after Anne's death, he married her. No fanfare was delayed, no protocol restrained. The wheels of ceremony turned with well-oiled certainty, as if nothing had interrupted them at all. Jane arrived at court, not as a bride, ushered in solemnly after a national loss, but as a queen whose place had always waited patiently to be filled. The fabric of royal life had no tear to mend it, had already rewoven itself overnight. For the courtiers, this demanded a rapid, almost theatrical shift. The expressions of grief they might have worn had to be buried as deeply as Anne herself. The ladies who had once served the former queen traded allegiances swiftly. Their silence was their survival. Their hands, which had once adjusted Anne's gowns, now embroidered Jane's initials. They did not speak of the woman who had come before. If they did, it was only in hushed tones, and only behind locked doors. To be associated with Anne Boleyn was no longer a mark of favour, it was a liability, a risk, and those who had once dared to love her learned quickly that love, at Henry's court, could become a noose faster than a whisper, could travel from ear to ear. Even the buildings seemed complicit. In palaces where Anne's crest had adorned the walls, where a white falcon crowned with gold had once perched on every beam, painters were dispatched in the dead of night. They worked with brushes and blades, scraping away her initials, replacing her falcon with Jane Seymour's phoenix. Windows were re-leaded. Tapestries unstitched. Symbols were dangerous. Reminders even more so. The Queen had not only been executed, she was being erased. And the court, eager to remain in step with the King's ever-changing will, participated without hesitation. This was not mourning. This was performance. And the role required was forgetfulness. There was no court eulogy, no moment of silence in chapel. The bishops did not mention her in prayer. Her name, once spoken with reverence, that was now an absence, a blank space left intentionally unfilled. She was not dead. She was undone. And in her undoing, those who had watched her rise learned something even more chilling than the sight of her execution. That power at Henry's court did not come with a foundation. It came with a trapdoor. Henry himself set the tone. He did not wear black. He did not attend any kind of private service. He did not issue a decree of remembrance. His mind, by all appearances, that was already turned toward the future, toward securing the male heir Anne had failed to produce, toward celebrating the coming of a more docile, more obedient queen. In private, Some claimed he showed relief. Others whispered that he showed nothing at all. And perhaps that, too, was part of the message. A queen had died, and the king had barely blinked. But beneath the smooth surface of courtly routine, something darker stirred. Those who had watched Anne's destruction understood that it had not come from a single accusation, or a single trial, or a single sword swing. It had come from the slow, deliberate machinery of royal will, a machinery that could be turned on anyone. If a queen, crowned at Westminster, anointed by the church, mother to the king's child, could be called a traitor and put to death in less than 3 weeks, then what protection did any of them truly possess? Fear settled like fog. Courtiers smiled more cautiously, spoke more quietly. Letters were burned, friendships abandoned. The court shimmered with its usual splendor. Banquets resumed. Masks were performed, hunting parties arranged. But underneath it all, there was a new etiquette written in blood. Do not linger on the past. Do not question the king. And above all, do not remember Anne Boleyn. And yet, despite this orchestrated forgetting, fragments of her remained tiny, dangerous, glinting pieces that could not be swept away. A ring, once worn by her lady-in-waiting, hidden beneath layers of silk. A locket with her portrait, passed from one hand to another in secret. A poem written in haste by a courtier who had once adored her, hidden behind the paneling of his chamber. Even in silence, Anne whispered, Elizabeth, too, remained. The child of disgrace, left in a strange limbo, not quite royal. Notekite discarded. The court treated her as an inconvenience, a living reminder of a woman no one was allowed to speak of. But she survived, watched, listened. She grew in the corners of the court, absorbing every lesson that silence could teach. Her mother's name was not spoken to her. Her mother's image was not shown to her. And yet she carried Anne with her in her eyes, in her voice, in her mind. The queen was gone. But the court's attempt to pretend she had never existed would not last forever, because Anne Boleyn, though denied a tomb,
Goodbye, my dear.
denied remembrance, denied even the simple dignity of posthumous respect, had planted something no king could uproot, a daughter, and through that daughter, a future. And though Henry's court tried to carry on without a backward glance, the history would not be so obedient. The court that pretended nothing happened would one day find itself ruled by the child it tried to forget. The scaffold on Tower Green was meant to be an end, a final line drawn through a name that had once echoed through court halls with laughter, defiance, and power. Anne Boleyn was meant to be a footnote, a cautionary tale, a dangerous woman turned into dust. Her execution was designed not only to silence her voice, but to reshape how she would be remembered, or more precisely, how she would be forgotten. And yet, the sharp edge of the French sword did more than sever bone and sinew. It severed a timeline. It carved a wound so deep into the English psyche that centuries later, people would still return to it not to mourn, but to ask questions no clean narrative could answer. What happened that day was not just a death. It was the beginning of a war over memory. A war that Henry thought he had won with one swing of a blade. But history does not obey kings. In the immediate aftermath, Henry's court moved quickly to reshape the story. Official statements were drafted. Chronicles recorded the proceedings with polite brevity. The charges, adultery, incest, treason were accepted without question, even though their absurdity clung to every word. The rapid trial, the conveniently timed confessions, the political usefulness of her death, it was all too neat. But neatness was the point. Anne's fall had to appear inevitable. Her execution had to seem just... The English people, already disoriented by religious upheaval and royal scandal, needed a story they could swallow, and so they were given one: a faithless wife, a dangereuse séductrice, a woman too ambitious for her own good. Better to remember her as a corrupting force than as a queen who had changed the very course of the nation. To ensure this version endured, Henry took no chances. Her portrait were destroyed, her initials scraped from palace walls. Her motto, "The Most Happy," was silenced in court masques and banquets. Artists were ordered to reuse canvases. Court poets were discouraged from composing elegies. It was not enough for Anne Boleyn to be dead. She had to be absent. Removed not only from power, but from recollection. Those who had once served her were scattered. Those who had once supported her were watched. Even her daughter was renamed in absence, stripped of her title, pushed to the margins of legitimacy. But truth has a strange endurance. And even the best lies crumble under the weight of curiosity. Over time, the contradictions in Anne's story began to widen like cracks in a wall. Historians re-examined the records. The dates didn't line up. The testimonies were coerced. The evidence was hearsay. The 5 men executed alongside her. One of them, her own brother, had left behind no credible confession. The entire case, it seemed, had been crafted not from fact, but from fear and necessity. Thomas Cromwell, the king's ever-loyal minister, had orchestrated the affair with cold calculation. Knowing that Anne's fall would clear the path for Jane Seymour and a hoped-for male heir, and so, piece by piece, the narrative began to shift. Anne was no longer simply the villain of Henry's second marriage. She became something more complex, more human, a reformist, a thinker, a woman who had challenged the Pope's authority, a queen who read forbidden texts, who debated theology, who imagined a different England, and with each new discovery, each new voice revisiting the scaffold on Tower Green, the story that Henry tried to seal beneath the chapel stones rose again. Yet even in these retellings, another truth emerged, one more unsettling than the lies that had buried her. Anne's execution had succeeded in reshaping history. Not because it was just, but because it was memorable. The drama of her fall, the elegance of the sword, the whispered rumors of her final gaze, these details endured because they had been crafted to endure. In trying to erase her, Henry had inadvertently turned her into legend. And legends do not die. They evolve. Anne's name began to reappear in unexpected places. A forgotten locket, a hidden manuscript, the faint outline of a falcon discovered beneath layers of paint in an old royal chapel. Her story inspired playwrights, poets, novelists, not because it was neat or resolved, but because it pulsed with unanswered questions. Was she guilty? Was she innocent? Was she a victim? A survivor? A schemer undone by her own ambition? Or a mother sacrificed to a monarchy that devoured the women it could not control? The power of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in its horror, but in its ambiguity. It forces the observer to reckon with the fragility of truth when truth is dictated by power. She was condemned by a court that existed to serve the crown. She was tried by men who feared for their own survival. She was sentenced to death in a process so rapid it bordered on theatre. And yet, centuries later, the court's version of events reads like fiction. While her final words ring with authenticity, she forgave the king. She prayed for his soul. She died with composure that unsettled even her enemies. And so, the execution did rewrite history, but not in the way Henry intended. For Anne Boleyn, it was meant to be the end. A full stop. A warning to other women who might rise too far or speak too freely. But her death became a beginning. It gave birth to an Elizabethan age. It gave weight to the dangers of absolute monarchy. It left behind a question that would haunt historians for generations. What does it mean to be erased today? Anne's name is spoken more than Henry's. Her portrait hangs in museums. Her signature is studied in books. Her falcon, once scrubbed from walls, is engraved in jewellery and remembered in film. The arrow chest that held her body has long vanished. But the memory of what it represented remains carved in the public imagination. Because the truth is, no execution can ever truly erase a person. Not when her story continues to be asked. Not when the silence she was forced into becomes the space where others begin to speak. Anne Boleyn died on a May morning beneath a grey sky. Her body wrapped in linen. Her head cradled beside her in an old wooden box. But her execution did not silence her. It gave her voice form scattered, buried, resurrected, but never quite extinguished. The execution that was meant to erase her instead ensured she would never be forgotten. Some deaths vanish into the quiet folds of time, swallowed by centuries, remembered only in dusty records and forgotten graves. Others linger, not just because they were unjust, or violent, or unforgettable, but because they left behind a silence so deliberate, so heavy, that it demands to be questioned. Anne Boleyn's death was such a silence. It did not end her. It did not erase her. It became the space from which her memory would echo, slowly at first, then louder with every generation that dared to look back and ask why a queen was slaughtered for daring to speak, to rise, to think. And so, on this night, centuries after the tower lights dimmed, after the executioner's blade cooled, after the crowd dispersed without prayer or pause, we return to her, not in spectacle, but in stillness, not to watch her fall again, but to understand why she was made to fall at all, and why she refused, even in death, to disappear. There is something quiet about Anne's story when the noise is stripped away. Beneath the court drama, beneath the scandalous charges, beneath the gilded gowns and whispered betrayals, is the shape of a woman who defied the rhythm expected of her. She did not follow the slow, obedient steps laid out for noble women. She did not become the consort content with proximity to power. She became a force. She dared to wield influence in her own right. She changed a nation's faith. She argued with bishops. She read the scriptures in English. She outthought the men who believed themselves her masters. She was not flawless, but she was never forgettable, and perhaps that was her true crime. For a Tudor court raised on obedience and carefully masked ambition, Anne's presence was too bright, too articulate, too dangerous. She did not whisper from behind the king's shoulder. She spoke at the table. She challenged ideas. She shaped policy. And in doing so, she crossed an invisible line drawn not by law, but by fear, a line that said, a woman may be adored, but never too much, trusted, but never with statecraft, beautiful, but never beyond control. When Anne fell, it was not because she had lost the king's love, but because she had outgrown the role he had written for her, and so, her execution was not a simple act of punishment. It was a ritual of containment. They cut off her head. Yes. But what they were really trying to sever was the idea of her. The idea that a woman could step into the realm of power and survive it. The idea that a woman could matter in history, not just as a mother or mistress, but as a mind. And yet, here we are. Her name endures, not because she was martyred, not because she was perfect, but because she became something rarer than either. She became real. A woman whose voice broke through the centuries, because it was once forced into silence. A woman who, even when reduced to a shadow in official memory, refused to stay buried. She did not haunt the tower like a ghost in a white dress. She haunted the archives, the letters, the lineage, the questions, and in doing so, she rose again, not in body, but in myth, in legacy, in blood. Elizabeth, her daughter, would rule for 44 years. Her court would become the envy of Europe. Her intellect, the sharpness of her tongue, her mastery of statecraft, none of it came from nowhere. It came from a mother who had once fought to reshape a nation. And though Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne, she never forgot her. How could she? Every crown she wore, every foreign ambassador she outwitted, every rebellion she crushed with ink and policy. There was a silent testament to the woman who had given her fire and then vanished beneath stone. There is something sacred in that kind of silence. A kind that teaches without preaching. A kind that survives through actions, not titles. And perhaps that is why Anne Boleyn refused to disappear, not because someone kept her memory alive, but because the world she helped shape could not exist without her fingerprints still on its surface. We speak of queens now not just as wives or mothers, but as rulers. We tell their stories not just in romance or tragedy, but in complexity, and that, too, is part of Anne's legacy. She opened a door. It closed on her neck. Yes, but it did not stay shut. So tonight, as we settle into sleep, let us hold one last image, not of the scaffold, not of the sword, not even of the crowd that gasped as her blood touched the wood. Let us imagine, instead, a quiet moment. The night before, a small chamber in the tower, Anne kneeling in prayer, not for herself, but for her daughter, her hands clasped, her back straight, her voice steady. A queen, stripped of crown, stripped of allies, stripped of every title, but still unbowed, still believing that something beyond her death would endure, that the silence she had been forced into might one day become the space where her daughter would speak. And it did. Anne Boleyn did. But her silence spoke louder than any sword. It reminded us that power may destroy a body, but it cannot bury truth. It taught us that a woman's voice once heard cannot be unremembered. No matter how many hands try to erase it, she was meant to be forgotten. Instead, she became unforgettable. And in that quiet, eternal defiance, Anne Boleyn found her crown,